Hi everybody, let's look at civil liberties and civil rights, chapter 4, there's a PowerPoint, blah blah blah, getting into it. Think the anti-founders for the Bill of Rights. I say anti-founders a little jokingly. We think of the founders of America as those that supported the Constitution, the greatest document that has ever existed on the history of the planet in any way, shape, or form forever. That's how great the Constitution is. It's the greatest thing in the history of the world forever. However, the Constitution was not just written by the quote-unquote founders of the nation, the people that, let's say, supported the Constitution. It was a compromise document that also included ideas from people that did not support what the founders supported and ultimately did not support the Constitution. The Constitution itself has rights enumerated in it, and it has some limits on government. Part of what the Constitution does is it tells you what government can do and what the role of government is. And part of like the philosophical thinking is that if the Constitution just tells you what the government can do, but it does not always tell you what the government can't do, then that means that the government can only do what is in the Constitution. So, let me back up. If I say you can, let's say I say on a test, you can use your book, your notes, but you cannot use a friend. Well, I didn't say anything about internet in there, right? So, theoretically, you could make a legal argument that if I would have, because I listed one thing you cannot do, if I listed one thing you cannot do, if there are other things that are not included in that list and I didn't want you to do them, then I would have included them. But I didn't include them, therefore it's okay for you to do. So that would be, in my class, wrong, but the idea here is that if we maintain the Constitution to what the government can do and not talk about what it can't do, then that means that the Constitution can be interpreted as only allowing the government to do what it says the government can do, and not risk the idea that if the Constitution doesn't say the government can't do something, then that means the government either can do it or might be able to do it. It's a lot of double negatives, difficult, whatever. Anyway, this idea wasn't enough for a lot of people in the States. My alarm's going off. Wasn't good enough for a lot of people in the States as they wrestled with whether or not they would want to adopt the Constitution. The anti-federalists argued for and pushed for the inclusion of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we call today the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights lay out sort of what are generally considered to be a lot of the foundational rights of America. Hurrah! The Constitution was adopted in 1798. The Constitution was adopted in 1789. Sorry, switching numbers. 1789. The Constitution was adopted in 1789. And the Bill of Rights was confirmed, were approved as amendments to the Constitution in 1791. 1791. Okay. So it took the inclusion of the Bill of Rights to get the Constitution ratified by enough states for it to become the law of the land. An interesting an interesting tweak. An interesting thing about the Constitution is, in the Bill of Rights, is that initially the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government, not the states. So, when the Constitution says in the First Amendment you have totally the freedom of speech and whatnot, it means that the federal government can't abridge your free speech. State government, have at it. Do what you will. Totally awesome. So, the Constitution as originally written didn't include the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights were amendments. And the Bill of Rights initially only applied to what the federal government could and could not do. All right. Slide 3, against government. The traditional view that Americans have had regarding freedoms and rights is that they are rights and freedoms that people have against government, meaning they can claim the right to free speech against government interference. They're help carve out a area of personal space, let's say around somebody, where government cannot cross into. That's a negative view of freedom, a negative view of liberty, meaning that freedom exists when government is absent. Okay, there's another view of freedom, a positive view of freedom, a positive view of liberty, which says that the government takes certain active steps to ensure people have freedoms or to provide freedoms to people. So this is a very important and interesting debate throughout American history as to should we view freedoms as purely a negative thing? And I mean negative not in bad, but negative as in freedoms exist in the absence of something, like if you have, your x-rays came back and you had a negative test for a broken bone. That just means there's the absence of a broken bone. Whereas if you tested positive for a broken bone, that means there's the existence of a broken bone there. So think of it that way, not bad and good. Should we have a negative view of freedom or a positive view of freedom, or are there some things where you have positive views of freedom and some where you have negative views of freedom? Things like that. Embedded in this negative view of freedom is that government should treat all the people equally. Now, the idea of equality is itself, again, something that is up for debate. Is it equal to treat everybody exactly the same regardless of that person's particular situation? Or does government have some role in looking at people differently depending on their social, physical, economic, mental situations to help create maybe additional equality? So you could say every child has a right to education and the government treats everybody. Another alarm. Everybody has a right to an education, and a government must treat everybody equally. Now, if there's a kid that lives with their family in the middle of a cabin in a cabin in the middle of Montana, 5 miles from the closest school or 10 miles from the closest school, is the government treating that child unequally, or maybe violating that child's rights and freedoms to an education if the government does not provide transportation for the child to school? Okay, so if the child can't get to school, they can't necessarily exercise their right to have school, right? But if the government says, we're only going to bus kids to school that live within a mile of the school, the government's treating kind of everybody equally, right? By saying, here are the rules. We're not going to treat anybody differently based upon these rules. It's not like, if you live 3 miles, if like family Johnson lives 3 miles away from the school, and family Smith lives 3 miles in another direction out of the school, we're just going to pick up one. We're going to pick up the Johnsons and not the Smiths. They're treating the Johnsons and Smiths equally by not picking them up. But is that true equality? Is that what equality really looks like? The debate, the question that we are faced with. We have talk about it a little more. Another one, classic, easy one to wrap your head around, I think, handicap parking spaces. The government is, some would say, not treating people equally by having handicap parking spaces because some people get preferential parking. The other people would say the government is treating people equally because it's giving handicapped people equal access to, economic life by allowing them equal access to stores and things like that. So, yeah. One of the big things with the government treating people equally is people's rights to due process of law. All right. You see this play out a lot in criminal cases, and lots of people get very frustrated with this issue in criminal cases. So in order for the government to punish you for breaking a law, the government has a high burden of proof to meet, and it's got to do things in a very meticulous, standardized way. So one, you're innocent until proven guilty, right? So the idea there is it protects against government running around and just arresting people for the heck of it, okay? And two, the government has to follow the same procedures to convict everybody. And if it doesn't follow the same procedures for everybody, that means it didn't treat people equally in trying to convict and punishing them before the law. And that unequal treatment can get somebody, off on a technicality. All right. Generally, this is considered, when, you think about it in the abstract, a good thing. Because once the government can start arbitrarily making decisions as to what steps they need to do to, jail one person or another for a crime, that opens up the area for government abuse. So the government can say, we're going to convict Robert of stealing televisions. However, we only have to get 3 other people to agree that he stole the televisions, and the government gets to handpick them from a panel of television maker executives who are annoyed that anybody steals TVs, and so they're probably just going to put anybody in jail who is suspected of stealing TVs. Whereas Sally, she's being, the government's arresting her for stealing TVs. However, they're going to give her a trial by a jury of her peers, where there are like 12 people or something on the jury, and try and convict her that way for stealing TVs. That's not fair, right? If the government stacks the deck against me in trying to punish me for stealing TVs versus how they treated Sally. So this, the need for government to follow specific and clear rules and regulations when they go out to violate somebody's rights or to infringe upon somebody's freedoms and rights, the need for them to follow certain policies and procedures is very important to make sure they don't start treating people unequally, which is why when a police officer or administrator somewhere makes a small mistake, that a lot of people, when they look at sort of the issue within an individual case, think it absurd that somebody would get off on that small technicality. So everybody knows that Joe Smith robbed that store. Made up a name and a thing. Everybody knows Joe Smith robbed the store. It's super obvious. There's like a camera and something else, I don't know, that says Joe Smith robbed the store. However, the government has, let's say, 5 pieces of evidence they're going to use to try and convict Joe Smith of robbing the store. But if they only release 4 of those pieces of evidence to the defense, for the defense to mount its defense against the government, trying to convince people that Joe Smith either didn't rob the store or that there's reasonable doubt that he did, the whole case against Joe Smith can get thrown out because the government omitted that one piece of evidence. And if they do that, then the trial's not seen as fair. The government did not treat everybody equally. Joe Smith was denied his due process, and so he gets to go home free. Yay! Again, when we think about this in the abstract, it tends to seem to be a good thing that the government can't run around and just say, I'm going to punish you for breaking the law, and I'm going to apply this standard to convict you, this very low standard to convict you. And you over there, I'm going to ignore you breaking the law because I like you, and I'm going to charge you with breaking the law, but I'm going to make it impossible for anybody to convict you by making a very high standard or whatever. We don't want government to go around and do that. That's the way kings act. They rule by decree, not by laws. A nation of laws is one where everybody has that equality, everybody has that due process, where the government has to abide by the laws, and if the government doesn't follow the laws in violating the rights of citizens, then the citizens' rights don't get violated, even if it is clear to any common person out there that Joe Smith robbed that store. Okay? Cool, got it. We'll pick back up in a little while, though for you it won't seem like a little while. It'll be right now. Now, just because the Constitution guarantees certain rights, theoretically, it does not necessarily mean that the states are following the rights or guaranteeing the rights to the people that are in the Constitution. Nor does it necessarily mean that the rights guaranteed in the Constitution are part of American legal tradition. There's a sort of weird thing where rights in this country, even though they might be stated somewhere, don't really seem to become completely real until a court rules on an issue regarding those rights. Because the interpretation of the Constitution, the interpretation of amendments are always up for grabs until a court comes in and says, this is what that means. You know, this is actually what the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment means. This is actually what the Second Amendment means, etc., etc. So the 14th Amendment applied the Bill of Rights to the states, protections of citizenship and equal protection under the law to the states. However, it wasn't really until the courts ruled on specific cases that the protections the 14th Amendment offered to citizens became real. They became the protections in the Constitution were sort of implemented at the state level through a process of selective incorporation, where it took specific cases before the court for the Supreme Court to say, yes, the 14th Amendment plus the First Amendment requires that the state does X, Y, Z. The page 98 shows the slow, gradual incorporation of the Bill of Rights at the state level through the 14th Amendment. So there's that. For example, eminent domain, 1897. The states could take land from people without, like, having due process or just compensation for that land until that happens in America up until 1897, when the Supreme Court stepped in and said, well, actually, no, we have this 14th Amendment now, and the 14th Amendment guarantees to the people all the rights in the Constitution. So states, you have to stop violating sort of what we would consider today basic fundamental freedoms. Now, the 14th Amendment was very much necessary because state governments have a very inconsistent history of respecting fundamental rights of people. And even smaller local governments have an even more and drastic, inconsistent history of respecting the rights to the Constitution. West Virginia v. Barnett, Supreme Court case, forgot Douglas wrote it. Justice Jackson wrote the decision in this court case. Jackson says, this is about school boards, such boards, meaning school boards, are numerous and their territorial jurisdiction often small, but small in local authority may feel less sense of responsibility to the Constitution and the agencies of publicity publicity, may be less vigilant in calling it to account. The actions of Congress in making flag observance voluntary and respecting the conscience of the objector in a matter so vital as raising the Army contrast sharply with these local regulations in matters relatively trivial to the welfare of the nation. There are village tyrants as well as village Hamptons, but none who acts under the color of the law is beyond reach of the Constitution. Translating for early 1900s speak. But the idea there is the further away the government gets from the Constitution, the less responsibility that the government feels to protect the constitutional rights of its citizens. You will find routinely the governments that are actually closer to the people more likely to violate the constitutionally protected rights of the people, which seems very counterintuitive that because the government that's closer to the people should be more responsive to the rights of the people, because, you know, you're like, I can walk up and say, yo, city council dude, stop violating my rights. I can't get that close to a senator and tell them to stop violating my rights. The issue is that the making sure that the fundamental rights of the people are respected is an everyday thing that a senator or a congressperson at the national level has to keep in mind. The Constitution and the constitutional protections there are sort of in your face every single day. You're paying a lot more attention to that. Whereas at the local level, the distance that you have from the Constitution and having to worry about it as a governing document also gives you distance from feeling like you need to respect the rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. So the state and local governments are very much at risk of violating those amendments. To be fair, up until the 14th Amendment, the state and local governments didn't necessarily need to adhere to any of the rights protected in the Constitution, but there you have it. I want to talk about gaining rights, about how rights have slowly been gained over time in a couple of cases. Before I do that, I want to talk about American values versus implementation of the values. So America has a very long history of being, hooray, freedom, everybody's equal, go, equality, America, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and everybody can do great, rah, rah, rah. However, actually implementing those ideas hasn't always been America's strong point. Consider, for example, the Constitution has been in place for roughly 227 years. Everybody theoretically is equal under the law and has the right to vote under the Constitution to express themselves. But it wasn't until 1964 that you could really say that everybody had an equal right to vote. In 1964, the Civil Rights, the Voting Act helped to end at least a lot of the practices at the state level that were used to violate the voting rights of Black Americans. And, I mean, essentially in the South, those rights did not exist. Okay? Only in the past 60 years have people had, have a lot of people had access to rights. As we'll talk about in a minute, there's still some areas where things, you might argue, rights are not conferred to everybody. Despite the fact that America doesn't have a great job of living up to its values, the values itself, having those values is a very good thing, and has opened up the opportunity for people to push for fundamental rights for everybody in the first place. Because pointing to Jefferson and Madison and Washington and Lincoln and all of these people through American history who have all espoused this same political culture of every single person is equal, that we all have certain rights and values or rights and liberties that the government cannot override. By being able to appeal to that, civil rights leaders throughout history have been able to point out hypocrisy and been able to appropriate the sort of true, or what they would call the true ideals of America as their own, and say, listen, if you want to be truly American, if you want to fulfill the promise of this great nation, if you want to be like Madison, be like Jefferson, be like Lincoln, be like Washington, etc., you've got to make sure everybody has equal right to vote. You've got to make sure there is no housing discrimination. You've got to make sure that everybody has equal access to public schools. You've got to make sure that everybody has the right to a fair trial. So that values have been very, very useful. Okay. One other thing that I like to talk about is how the march towards freedom and equality is not linear. Theodore Parker originally said this, and Martin Luther King Jr. made it famous, that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, or the moral arc of the universe is long, it bends towards justice. It's something along those lines. With all due respect, they're wrong. It's people that move that arc of the universe, and it doesn't necessarily bend towards justice. It bends however people want it to bend. And we see that actually play out in the civil rights struggles throughout history, that it's not that we've had this sort of slow, steady climb towards equal rights for everybody. It's that people have been involved in grabbing hold of society and sort of dragging them, kicking and screaming along, to making sure everybody has equal rights. Once people stop struggling for their freedom and equality, we start to see backsliding, where the forces who are like, yay, bigotry, start to take over again and start to push back against any gains made in that arc of justice tends towards bigotry. So, very much in American history, our movement towards more inclusive civil rights is one that is very hard, it's very bloody, and it needed people to stand up and actively force others to go along with it. It is not some sort of passive action that sort of, oh, as the generations grow up, things will just get progressively better. No, you've got to force the younger generations to be better. So, gaining rights, Katy Perry quote, Katy Perry riding a tiger or a lion at the Super Bowl. She's excited because she has rights. Alright, I want to talk about Brown v. Board of Education. I think then I'm going to go to a doctor's appointment, and then I'll be back, but you won't know the difference. Okay, so Brown v. Board of Education, one of the seminal civil rights Supreme Court cases in the 20th century and really of all time. It's super awesomely interesting and cool for a bajillion reasons, but I'm just talking about a few. So, first off, Brown v. Board of Education, we need to start off about 50 years earlier with Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896 where there was a lawsuit saying that by having separate accommodations on a train car for white and black people, they were violating the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, that everybody needed to be treated equally, which meant you didn't need to have separate accommodations. You couldn't have separate accommodations. You couldn't segregate. Plessy versus Ferguson decided that you could in fact segregate, that you could separate people and still maintain equality, okay? That you could have separate but equal. One of the linchpins of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision was that separate but equal meant in part that there were equal facilities, equal investment, sort of all that jazz between, in this case, the whatever the white accommodations were and whatever the black accommodations were, whatever the sort of thing was at issue, hotel rooms or pools or trains or whatever, buses, etc. That this segregation was okay, separate but equal is okay. Move forward 60 years, 50 years, math somehow, to 1954, you have Brown v. Board of Education. Brown v. Board of Education is an amazing case, and it's also, from what I've seen, one of the most misunderstood cases of all time. It's really amazing that a case can be so important and so seminal to sort of American politics and yet be so misunderstood. So think back in your head, close your eyes and imagine, what does segregation look like to you in your head? When we think of separate but equal and we think about legal segregation, what comes to mind? Got it in your head? Good. What you probably thought of, because I can read your mind, are separate water fountains. One that says like colors only, one that says whites. And the white water fountain looks pretty awesome. It's super clean, new, amazing. The colored only water fountain looks like if you touch it, you're going to die from some disease. They're disgusting. Not well maintained. The facilities are not equal. And we see throughout American history that separate but equal very rarely came to pass, in the sense that the black facilities were always given less, not always, in the vast majority of cases, given less resources. Black schools were a lot worse than white schools. Less desks, test books, teachers, things like AC, were not given the same resources as white schools. And we traditionally think of separate but equal as not working because the facilities never were actually equal. And Brown v. Board of Education says that separate but equal can never actually be equal. However, the Brown v. Board of Education decision does not actually turn on the fact that facilities are not equal. What's amazing about this case is that this is the full name of the course, or the case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In Topeka, Kansas, everybody agreed, and this was not an issue, that the black schools and the white schools were exactly equal. That's amazing, right? That the black schools and the white schools had actually achieved physical, resource, tangible equality. So in this court case, that was not at issue. Because, again, I stress and I say again, in Topeka, Kansas, the black schools were exactly as good as the white schools. Clear? Got that? And that's a very important distinction to make, also because of sort of the implications of the Brown v. Board of Education if it was founded on that point. So the Supreme Court did not say separate but equal is unconstitutional because separate but equal has never actually worked in real life, that we never actually have equal resources. They said separate but equal is unconstitutional because legal segregation can never be truly equal. They point to not an issue of sort of politics and resources and whatnot, but an issue of psychology. They say that segregation of white children and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Whatever may have been the extent of the psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, this finding is amply supported by modern authority. Any language in Plessy versus Ferguson contrary to this finding is rejected. Okay? We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated for whom the actions have been brought are, by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Okay. So what they're saying here is, and they explained earlier, again, 100%, Topeka, Kansas has achieved pure equality in terms of schools. They have achieved separate but equal. However, we have seen the effects that segregation has on people of the race that is deemed inferior by the law. Let's face it, obviously segregation laws were not maintained because the people who made the segregation laws thought that the races were equal and awesome and all that jazz. It very clearly was always about white superiority. Because it was always about white superiority, because that message was communicated through politicians, through newspapers, through popular culture, through all that stuff, it created the sense of inferiority in the oppressed group. And in this case, the message from your leaders that you are inferior, that you are, I guess for lack of a better word, kind of like a subhuman or not a full human being like white people are, creates an inferiority complex. And when you have that sort of emotional damage done to you, it makes it hard to learn. It makes it almost impossible to learn. How are you supposed to go to school and achieve anything when everything about the society you're in tells you you will never amount to anything? and it also closes off any avenues for you to amount to anything. There's a video linked here called the doll test. It's a test that first happened in the 1940s, and to show that racism isn't over today, has been replicated every single decade from the 1940s to this day, showing that our society has inflicted a sense of inferiority in black children, and inflicted a sense in white children that black children are inferior. You'll see in this doll test, they're given either, a white doll or black doll, or they're given a color chart of, a white children, and then children slowly getting darker. And they're asked things like, can you show me the children? Can you show me the child which is the good child? What child is the bad child? What child is smart? What child is dumb? What child is nice, mean, etc. Very consistently and overwhelmingly, both white and black children will choose a white doll as being the good doll, the smart doll, the nice doll, the pretty doll, and the black doll as being the mean doll, dumb doll, ugly doll, etc. And it's kind of interesting to see in some cases, like you see that when they ask the black children to pick the doll which looks most like you see all of a sudden this realization sometimes in the child's head that, oh my goodness, like, I hate myself, or I don't think I'm very good because I've been saying the black doll is bad because that doll is black. And that subconscious sort of psychological damage that's done becomes very conscious to them. So even at a very young age, we see the racism that's in society impacting the mental well-being of children. All children, but especially black children. White children aren't necessarily hurt by feelings of inferiority, but they're hurt by holding racial prejudice, and we don't want people to have racial prejudice. So, that was a big part of Brown v. Board of Education. I think it's very important to stress, again, that one of the most important, if not the most important, civil rights cases in American history was not decided on if, that separate but equal is unequal because the facilities never were equal. It was because of the damaging effect that segregation, that forced segregation by law, that had a damaging effect on children. Now, one of the other interesting things with Brown v. Board of Education, and then also there's Brown v. Board of Education Part 2 that happened the following year, is that the court ruled that schools must desegregate with all deliberate speed. They said that you've got to do it. Go now. Don't wait 10 years. Don't wait 5 years. Get it done. Because there's children here that aren't able to wait for any of this to get done. Every year we delay is another year that children are being harmed by government action. And we got to stop this, Go. They sort of ordered local courts to oversee the desegregation of schools, and they did say that courts could take into account issues of like making sure and bringing up to code facilities and things like that. So, for example, you desegregate the schools, but you probably need a couple years to actually like build facilities that can handle desegregation, if that makes sense. If a school was only built to handle a certain number of children, you can't throw a different number of children in that school. You've got to modify things. So local school districts and states were given some time to adapt. However, they weren't given a lot of time. And you see lots of cases after Brown v. Board of Education where states try to continually delay implementation of desegregation, saying things even to the extent of we can't, it would cause too much civil unrest. People wouldn't feel comfortable with it, meaning white people wouldn't feel comfortable with it. You give us more time for people to come around to the idea, and the courts go, no, where this is going into place, if people feel uncomfortable with it, tough. The Constitution does not protect your right to discriminate against people, because the alternative would make you feel uncomfortable. So we had lots of cases. You can look at like the Little Rock, Arkansas case where the schools were finally desegregated, when the Eisenhower had to order the National Guard to come in and actually protect the 9 children that desegregated that school. Amazing stuff. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you should look into it. I think that's might be it for there. Schools since then have found other ways to resegregate, and if you look today, schools are more segregated today than they were in the 70s, for example. Like I said, that arc of the moral universe doesn't necessarily bend towards justice, it bends towards however we force it to bend. There's been this huge pushback, again, like we've seen in the political culture of where power should be in federalism at the federal level or the state level, as we reacted to the civil rights movement, to Nixon, to Vietnam. That power has moved back to the states, and as we've had power move back to the states, we've seen the resegregation of school systems. So there's that. I'll talk about some of the issues with women's rights, and then LGBT rights, and talk about freedom of religion and speech in schools, because I think that's something that has also a lot of misunderstanding around. I'll be back, but you won't necessarily know that I went away. Okay, I'm back. I know you missed me so much, and I had a costume change. Go for college. Let's talk about women's rights. Okay? So, the history of women's rights is very interesting. I could spend a whole semester discussing it with y'all. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to spend, hopefully, not that long discussing it with y'all. So, voting rights is normally sort of where we first start thinking about where women's rights, sort of begin and what's the important thing there. Wyoming was the very first state that where women earned the right to vote, or got the right to vote, or whatever, were given the right to vote, however you want to phrase that. Wyoming and the western states in general were where women first got the right to vote. Wyoming's reason was, they had a couple of different reasons, but one of them was, we want to attract more women to come out here to Wyoming because we men are lonely and there are lots of us. So if they get the right to vote, women have an incentive to move to Wyoming. So that's cool. So that's one reason. First territory to get the right to vote. And when it went into the Union, I think it was Wyoming, where they wanted to admit Wyoming into America, but wanted to do it and not let women vote. And Wyoming was like, no, we're not entering the Union unless women can vote. And then people are like, okay, fine, women can vote. It wasn't until 1920, with the 19th Amendment, that women across the country got the right to vote. The suffrage, anti-suffrage debate is amazingly fascinating. And I encourage everybody to go out and read all about it. But the story for women's rights does not end there. Oh, BTW, suffrage, means voting rights. Enfranchisement, also voting rights. Suffrage. S-U-F-F-R-A-G-E, maybe? That's how you spell it? Suffrage. It is not suffer, which is a common mistake. Don't write women gain the right to suffer in whatever. I have read that a lot when people talk about women's right to vote and women's suffrage. Women got the right to suffer in 18 blah 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 whatever. Yeah, okay, so it's fun. But check that out, or whatever. Suffrage, okay. For a very long time, when a woman got married, she became literally, legally invisible. What I mean is, the marriage is a union between a man and a woman, in this case, who come together to form one body, one legal entity. And of course, who gets to be the head of that legal entity? The man. Yeah, the man does. So as the head of that legal entity, the man is the one that can enter into contracts, that can own stuff, that occasionally, gets kind of interesting, is responsible for crimes if a woman commits a crime. I'll return to that for a second. Earned all the money, so if the woman earned any money, she didn't really earn money, it was the man that earned the money. The man was it. The woman was no longer a person. So marriage was pretty awesome, huh? As a matter, whoa, okay, you ready? The issues surrounding rape laws really throughout all of English common law, going back to the 1300s through even today, are kind of horrific and a whole case study in of itself in terms of how women are viewed and women's rights and whatnot. But for a very long time, a wife could not charge her husband with rape, because if they are the same legal entity, literally, again, this is how literal it is, it would be the man who is bringing against himself the rape crimes, because the woman doesn't exist anymore according to the law. So the woman can't even bring a case. If any court were to accept a case or see a case of that, it would be the man who brought the case, not the woman. And so the man would be accusing him of rape if it's within the marriage, and that's doesn't make sense legally, which is why for a very, very, very long time, up until even just the last 20 or 30 years, in some areas it wasn't necessarily seen as rape if a husband raped his wife. So there's that. They're not seen as people. They earn money. Oh, being held for crimes. Men could sometimes legally beat their wife, not to the point of life being endangered and stuff, but because the man was in a number of cases legally responsible for the actions of his wife, the man was allowed to apply certain reasonable corrective measures to the woman to ensure that the woman, his wife, did not break any laws. So there's that. Okay? It wasn't until the 1970s that women, or maybe it was early 1980s, that women were given the undisputed right to own property and to make contracts. There's a court case in Louisiana where a woman's husband was, I think, in jail, and she tried to sign off on a second mortgage on the home, and the husband got out of jail and tried to say that the second mortgage never existed because his wife couldn't legally do anything with it. But the Supreme Court was like, yeah, it's time that women can own property too. Let's correct this. One of the big issues of women's rights today is an issue of pay equality. Sure, people have heard a woman earns 79 cents or 81 cents or 74 cents to every dollar a man earns, depending on sort of exactly how they're looking at the statistics. Certainly, without a doubt, wage discrimination exists in America, even within the same field. So we see it a lot in movie studios, where women actors get paid less than male actors. We see it among CEOs, executives, all the way down to your fast food workers and things like that. Now, one other thing that also exists that I think is important to point out or look at is historically there have been jobs that are traditionally seen as female jobs and jobs that have traditionally been seen as male jobs. Some pay equity can be accounted for the fact that women dominate some fields that pay less money, while men dominate other fields that pay more money. But here's the issue there, all right? This pay inequity in where people work did not come into being out of a vacuum. It did not just naturally appear. Let's put it that way. Teachers don't get paid a lot of money. I think generally people accept that, with a few exceptions. But in general, teachers are paid less than what their educational qualifications would be. A secretary does not get paid as much money as maybe somebody else who's got a different title but in a similar position. Those wages tend to be lower Nurses for a very long time got paid considerably less than, still get paid less than doctors, part because of education, but they got paid less than even you might expect based upon their education, if like there was a true free market out there setting prices. Here's why these fields get paid less. Because they were traditionally female-dominated jobs. And women don't need to make money. They don't need to make a lot of money. If a woman, teachers have traditionally, being a teacher has traditionally been a female field. If a woman has a job, it's a hobby, not really a job. She doesn't need to support a family or anything like that. So we as a society don't need to pay women as much. That historical pay inequity has extended from, sexist olden days all the way to today. There's a reason why jobs that are female-dominated or traditionally seen as female jobs pay less than jobs that are traditionally seen as male jobs. It's because of that gender discrimination through time. If a woman gets a job as a secretary or typist or telephone switchboard operator or anything like that, they got paid less, not because of any market situation or qualifications or whatever. They got paid less because they're women, and women don't need to be paid as much money as men. That's it. If men were the teachers, if men were the nurses and women were the doctors, if men dominated the field of being a secretary and women were not in that field, those jobs would pay more today than they do now, because they would have a long history of being paid more. Because if you're an employer, both consciously and subconsciously, you think to yourself, I need to pay a man more than a woman because the man is the breadwinner in the family. I need to pay the man more to attract him to work for me because he's got a family to support. This is a historical pay inequity that we still see ourselves trapped in today. If we were not trapped in it still today, teachers would get paid more money than they do. Secretaries would get paid more money than they do. Nurses would get paid more money than they do. Typists would get paid more money than they do. On and on and on and on. Housekeepers would get paid more money than they do if these were seen as male jobs all the way. That might have completed my thought. Can't remember now. Anyway, wage discrimination doesn't just exist within a job. The wage discrimination that we see exists between jobs because of historical sexism. And that's an area where women's rights activists are often trying to narrow that gap or close the gap to get people to see that it's weird that, a teacher who has a very high education, who has huge amounts of responsibilities, gets paid very little money, where an upper level manager of a business or company or CEO or an upper level manager in government, who undoubtedly also has a high level of education and responsibility, but they get paid a lot more than the teacher. Teachers, on average, make something like 1,500 executive decisions a day. These decisions impact the health and safety of children, of many, many children. They impact the future ability of America to succeed. So it's kind of a big deal, and they are highly technical fields that require very specific education. It is a job, again, that if it was a male-dominated field, there would be more money in it today than there is because sexism. So, moving on, LGBT rights. Just talk about a couple things here. Lawrence v. Texas, 2003. Gay people are now legally allowed across the country to have sex with each other. It's weird, I think, to think of the fact that legally same-sex sex has only been legal for 13 years all over the country. Some areas it was legal sooner. Texas, though, it was illegal until 2003. Weird. Okay, fine. But, hooray. Now gay people and lesbians can have the right to be physically intimate with each other. It's constitutionally protected. I didn't know that was something that you needed to constitutionally protect, but there it is. In the 90s, Clinton signed Don't Ask, Don't Tell into law, which said that you could be gay in the military if nobody knew you were gay, which makes you wonder what the point of the law was to begin with. Basically, I guess it said, we're going to stop asking what people's sexual orientation is. That's where the law went. Now, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was extremely important to people. Even, in some cases, more important than the push for marriage rights. There are two reasons for this. One, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was seen as lower-hanging fruit, an easier chance of getting that repealed. Getting Don't Ask, Don't Tell repealed, sorry. The other, though, is that citizenship in this country and who's viewed as citizens very much connected with who can serve in the military and who is serving in the military. If gay people can get the right to openly serve in the military, they're going to gain a lot of credibility in terms of everybody else seeing them as full and equal participants in society. So there is some political, maneuvering there to try and push towards a greater goal of full LGBT equality. But sometimes you have to do it a step at a time to drag people kicking and screaming along. One of those was, again, connected to military service. If people can see LGBT individuals serving in the military, then there'll be more people be more open to extending rights to them. Then there's the fight for marriage equality, which was also then like the next very big deal. Marriage equality does not make LGBT individuals in this country fully equal under the law. Unfortunately, it does not. In fact, since the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage was legal in this country, we've seen a pushback in lots of states to pass laws that would allow discrimination in public facilities. But again, the marriage rights thing is important, one, because it's more rights, but two, it's also another sort of feature of citizenship that can get people to, if they're not understanding and acceptive of gay and lesbian relationships now, they will be in the future. It's a way to sort of push through a normalization of those relationships so that a strategy for rights to be extended. There are, in some states, at the very minimum, questions regarding whether or not gay and lesbian individuals have the right to not be discriminated against in housing applications and in employment. Theoretically, in something like 37-ish states, maybe it's lower by now, you can be fired from your job simply because the boss finds out you are gay or lesbian. You can be not denied a housing application for the same reason. There are laws that help protect these basic rights, and they don't include sexual orientation or gender identity in the laws. Those are things that have to be written into them. Now, this is where things get complicated and interesting. The Obama administration has looked at these non-discrimination laws and said, well, look, this part of the law, you can't discriminate on the basis of gender or sex. These things are inexorably tied to issues of sexual orientation or sexual identity. Therefore, the law actually also does not allow discrimination against LGBT individuals when it comes to employment practices and housing. At the federal level now, the Obama administration has passed rules saying that you are not allowed to fire people for being gay or lesbian. However, at the state level, those laws do not exist. If somebody gets fired for being gay or lesbian, it's an open question as to whether or not the courts would read into the law as giving job protections or not giving job protections, which is why the sort of next frontier for LGBT rights has been some of that right to employment. Okay. Freedom in schools. Freedom for students. So, lots of talk. God's been taken out of schools, prayers taken out of schools, and that's why blah, blah, blah. Setting the record straight. Students have the right to pray in school. Students have the right to free speech in school. You can discuss religion with your friends at school, and you can read religious texts when you're at school. You can pass out religious tracts at school. You can pass out political tracts at school. You can advertise on behalf of your church, wear religious clothing at school. These are protected First Amendment rights. The issue is, in exercising these rights, the students cannot be disruptive to the educational or classroom environment, and the schools cannot even actively, or cannot be seen as actively endorsing one religion over another. So sort of what does this look like in practice? If I want to pray in school, I have to do it on my own time. I have to do it before class or after class, during lunch, whatever. One of the things that I actually kind of find interesting about the discussion of praying in school, depending on how you think about what prayer looks like, and I think lots of people in this country see prayer as you sort of offering up a prayer to God, and you can do that even silently. There is nothing anybody could ever do about forcing a student to not pray at any point in time during the day, because theoretically, that could be praying. I could have just been praying there, and nobody, no teacher or anybody will ever come over to a student who does this for like a minute or 30 seconds, or maybe prays with their eyes open, and say, "Stop that right now! I know what you're doing in your head. I can read your mind. You're totally praying right now, aren't you? Stop it. That's illegal in public schools." Doesn't happen. Not going to happen. Students can pass out religious tracts as long as it is during not class time. If the teacher's teaching, you can't stand up and say, "Hey everybody, let me tell you about Jesus." Just not allowed. You can go during lunch and say, "Hey, John, have you heard about Jesus?" If John says, "Nope, but leave me alone," nothing bad has happened yet. If that's just all that happens, and then the student leaves John alone. The practice of a student's religious faith has to not be forced or coerced on other students. It's another rule. Okay, so it can't be disruptive. You can't coerce it on other students. You can't intimidate other students to try and practice your specific faith, but you can have discussions with other people about whatever your religion is. You can read a religious book on your own. You can pray. You can have a group prayer, so long as you're not disrupting the learning environment, which is not going to happen if you do it, on your own time. Students have the right to free speech in schools, so long as, again, it does not disrupt the learning environment. And, well, I was going to say as long as it's not like vulgar or intimidates other people, but that would also be a disruption of the learning environment. So disruption of the learning environment kind of is a catch-all. Let's see, what's an example? Sarah had a student run down the hallway at her elementary school like a couple months ago, screaming, "Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter," just running down the hallway screaming that very loud. There's one teacher who wanted to get the student in trouble, not only because the student was screaming in the hallway, but because the student said Black Lives Matter and not nothing or all lives matter. So that was another issue, and Sarah shut that teacher down pretty quickly. It was like, "No, that's not what the issue is here. Stop it." The student got in trouble the way an elementary student gets in trouble, which is, let's just have a real brief talk about what's right and what's wrong. You can't run through class. You can't run through hall when class is going on because you're disrupting other students. Did you know that? And let's not scream in the hallways anymore. So the student was told to not scream anymore. But, Sarah told the student, if you want to hold a sign, like after school, that says Black Lives Matter, or before school, or, have a discussion about it, that's your right as an American. And she's like, "I'll be right out there with you." But we can't run through the hallways screaming anything. Doesn't matter what you're screaming. You could be screaming, "Learning is great! Learning is great! I love to learn!" Disruptive, can't scream that in the hallways. So that's an example there of what speech is acceptable, what speech is not acceptable, why certain speech gets in trouble and other speech doesn't. So somebody could look at that and say, that school is violating that student's freedom of speech because that person was screaming Black Lives Matter and they didn't like that. No. The issue is not the content of the speech, but the sort of place of the speech. Disruptive place. You'll see this lots of time with, okay, so here's the other example about prayer in school and stuff. The issue is not that students pray in school. The issue is students can't disrupt class or take time away from the learning class period to pray in school. So, however, if there's a news story that, Jimmy was stopped from praying in school, that's a violation, blah, blah, blah. Look at the seculars hating the Christians and stopping kids from praying in schools. The reason Jimmy would have been stopped is not the prayer, but the fact that it was taking place in an inappropriate time. That it was disruptive to other students. Cool. As for school-sponsored prayer, it is simply and completely unconstitutional for there to be a prayer over a loudspeaker at a football game. That's something that continually comes up. A coach cannot lead students in prayer before a football game. No school official can lead any person ever in the history of anything in prayer at school when they're acting in some sort of official capacity at school. If you're a teacher and you go to the same church as another student and you want to pray with the student in church, or you want to meet them at McDonald's later and pray with them, that's totally fine. You're not acting as a teacher anymore, and you're not representing the school. But it's about could this action be legitimately seen as the government sponsorship or endorsement of a religious belief? If it can, which is what happens when administrators take the lead to do anything like that, then it is a violation of the First Amendment. Now, if anybody is familiar with schools, you'll know that religious organizations do in fact exist in schools. The issue is the thing there is that those religious organizations have to be student organized, student initiated, and student led. There's obviously going to be a sponsor, a faculty sponsor, but the faculty sponsor cannot be, I'll just say, involved inappropriately with the religious club. The faculty sponsor can't tell the students this is how we're going to interpret the Bible or whatever holy text we're looking at. The faculty sponsor or the teacher sponsor or whatever can not push students to do certain things. That sponsor is there to help the students make sure they comply with school rules, to help them, if the students say, hey, we want to take a field trip, the person helps them fill out the forms or whatever. But they can't be seen as endorsing a specific religious viewpoint. That's how that goes. Okay. Questions to consider. See, Katy Perry's there. Let's see. They could be like this. That's her right. She's contemplating these issues, and she wants you to contemplate them too. Okay. To what extent is something a right, if you lack the means to exercise it. If we view rights as something that solely means there is no government interference in the ability for somebody to do something, is that still a right if you can't do that thing? So I have the right to free speech. But if I'm somehow, the government won't stop me. But if I'm unable to, for some reason, exercise that free speech, can I still be said to have that right? Looking at Money in Politics and Citizens United, the Supreme Court decided that money was speech, and that people had the right to spend money as an exercise of their free speech. Now, I have the right, just like anybody else, to spend money and, have that be an exercise of my free speech. However, I don't have a lot of money. I donated some money to Sanders, so I kind of exercised my free speech rights through money. However, that was like, $75. Rich person. Bill Gates is a rich person. He's got a whole crap ton of money, and now he can spend all of it, if he wants to, on the upcoming elections because it's his free speech rights. One of us has more access to the right of free speech than the other. Can we be said to be truly equal in this country? Could you say that I actually have the same free speech rights as Bill Gates if I don't have the means to access the free speech rights like Bill Gates does? I can't buy ads on television. I just don't have that money. Bill Gates can buy television stations. So there's a question to consider. It sort of gets at a fundamental viewpoint of how you view what rights and liberties are. Okay? The flip side to that is, does the government or society or some organization or entities within society have the responsibility that people can, to make sure that people can exercise constitutional rights? The free speech issue, again. We all have the right to free speech. Does the government have some responsibility or some place to regulate the free speech rights so that people's free speech rights can be at least somewhat equalized, so that Bill Gates' ability to engage in speech is not appreciably greater than mine? Some inequality will probably always exist, and we may all agree that some inequality there might be desirable for various reasons. However, do we want to put some type of upper limit on the amount of speech somebody can have to try and ensure that every single person can access it? Because it's another thing, too. There's a limited amount of space for free speech to happen. If Bill Gates buys it all, then I don't have any place to then even access my speech if I wanted to. So problem, issue, right? Question. There it is. What do we do? Another one that might maybe seem a little more obvious or easier, the right to an education. Every child in this country has a right to an education. That's pretty awesome. The government goes about and helps and makes sure that children can exercise those rights. If, for example, a child lives very far away from the school and can't get to school, they have the right to an education, but if they can't actually get to the school to have their education, can you say that they actually still have the right to that education? Philosophical question to think about, to consider. If the government has a responsibility to make sure the child not only has the right, but can exercise the right to an education, how far does the government's responsibility go? Is the government supposed to, move mountains to make sure a child has the right to an education? Or is there some, maybe lesser reasonable action that the government must take, but the right to the child's education does not necessarily trump the right of the government having, being forced to move a whole mountain range to get the child to school or something? We have the right to vote in this country. Is that a right that can be taken away? Another thing to think about, look at. If you're in jail, do you have the right to vote? Should you have the right to vote? Whatever. And if you live in the middle of nowhere, you have the right to vote, but does the government have the responsibility to provide you with a polling station where you can vote within within, let's say, 2 miles of where you are? Even if that polling station is only for you, does the government have to set up a polling station there? Or, if we say the government doesn't have to do that, does the government have some other responsibility to somehow reach out to you who lives in the middle of nowhere and make sure you have some type of easier access to the vote? Maybe the government doesn't have to set up a polling station, but maybe the government would be required to send you a ballot by the mail to make sure you access the right, you have the ability to access your right to vote. Maybe the right to vote doesn't require you to drive 50 miles to do it, to vote. Okay. Make a note of the last point here. Not necessarily right or wrong answers. As with everything, there do exist better and worse justified answers and better and worse thought out answers. But right or wrong doesn't necessarily come into play. It's about your values, your biases, and we don't all share the same of those. But these are the sort of big issues that people think about that, were sort of the fault lines of American political whatnots. Okay, I'm going to stop talking.